We are very excited about our next panel, Trauma Transcends Space and Time, and we have absolutely fantastic guests today. First off, we have Sofi Oksanen, a Finnish-Estonian author and playwright. She's one of the most awarded authors in all of Scandinavia, and her works have been translated in over 40 languages. Her works discuss historical events through an interpersonal lens and focus in particular on the experiences of women at the hands of conflict, state repression, and displacement. We also have Frida Johansson Metso, who is a psychologist and a coordinator of the Swedish Red Cross Competence Center for Rehabilitation from Torture and War Trauma. She specializes in working with refugees and asylum seekers who have experienced trauma, and also the relationship between trauma and storytelling. And finally, our lovely moderator Faiaz Dowlatzai, who is also an author, a journalist, and also a previous participant of UNHCR's Refugee Speakers Program. I now hand off the floor to you, Faiaz. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I hope you have had a fun day so far, and welcome. So I'll go straight to the questions. My first question is to you, Frida. How do you define intergenerational trauma? And could you please give some of the common signs or symptoms?
Good start. I would say second generation trauma, because it's easier to pronounce and it's also easier to picture what it's all about. So I told you earlier I have a very short answer to this, and then I have a longer. And I think this is nicer if it's a discussion, so I will take to make it in parts. But second generational trauma is the realization that traumatization is something that has very long consequences. We are used to thinking about people experiencing one potential traumatic event, a war experience, torture, persecution, and then develop stress-related disorders as post-traumatic stress. That's the disorder I'm most used to working with. But the relationship isn't that easy, and it isn't that simple. And that's actually a very empowering knowledge. But we will come back to that. But regarding the second generation, what we do know is that you can inherit your parents' trauma. And this is, as a biological fact, we know that children who have been born to mothers who had experienced a potential traumatic event and develop PTSD, their children have a higher risk for having a stronger stress reaction, so more cortisol in their blood levels. We can see this in other ways, but we can also see it in profiles of psychology and behavior. If your mother is scared all the time, if your mother has PTSD and she's scared about the world, she's scared for everything, she maybe has been through a man-made trauma like torture, someone else has chosen to harm you, look you into the eyes and decided to harm you, the risk that she have trust issues with other human beings, that she avoids certain places and situations, you will as a child learn, and you will learn that other people are dangerous, and that will also form not only you as a person but also societies. So that's the short answer what second generation trauma is.
Is it a question to me as well?
If you have anything related to that, I would love to hear.
Yes, and hello to everybody. I think I'm in all my novels in a way dealing with the second and even third generation traumas. And now with my latest book, I'm in my latest book. I'm focusing on Russia and the war crimes committed by Russia and gender-related crimes. But actually, I was thinking about Finland when we talk about second-generation traumas, because Finland went through Winter War and the War of Continuation. Still, actually, people are also experiencing traumas from the Civil War, which was almost 100 years ago. But the recent and living memory, war memories are related to Winter War and the War of Continuation. And now actually researchers are starting to investigate how it has affected our not only mental health, but also actually genes, which I think is very interesting. And Finland is a good place actually to focus on that, because we don't really move around. So we are there. We have been there. We are there, and Finns didn't leave as refugees. So in that way, we are still there. So in that way, that means that we have a lot of diseases others don't as well. But it means that it's a good pool for research. And when I think about alcohol is a big issue in Finland. We can say that it's a national problem. Quite many of my Finnish grandfather was a war veteran, of course, which means that my father was a child of a war veteran. And I have to say that my Finnish grandfather, who's now deceased, and he did have war traumas, quite obviously. But that means that it is a living memory. And also now with the war in Ukraine, everything happening in the world, then it does actually reflect to us as well. And when the large-scale invasion started, then actually in quite many old people's home, people actually elderly people thought that actually we are going to the next war in Finland, that they were actually reflecting their own memories, and they were not people with Alzheimer, for example. They were actually thinking that we are now back into 40s. So, which is a very interesting thing in a way, that how you actually react to different things. And what I do know is that memory is an interesting thing. Soviet Union, that was a place where people also recreated their past to secure themselves. And I remember this family, which the parents were true believers in communism. And then old grandmother, who started to have problems with the memory, started speaking French. And let me tell you, in Soviet Union, they didn't really learn French. So it was a kind of, certainly, they found out that their grammar was actually, the first language was French. And it was a kind of, weird thing for a communist, true communist family. And then you learn out that actually your grandmother was a noble lady whose home language was French during the Tsarist years of Russia. So it is understandable that she wanted to forget the French language, but it came back even in that kind of reality, that she forgot that she was living in the Soviet Union, and she was thinking that she was back in the world where it was okay to speak French. And then they hit the grandmother behind the doors. To secure the family's future, yes, yeah. But memory is an interesting thing. It just doesn't. Nothing, I think, disappears. It might always come back.
If I can just add to that, we were speaking about elderly people, senior people. So PTSD is, of course, we talk about it as a trauma disorder, but it is a memory disorder. And that is why writing about it and reading about it, it's so important, because every time we speak about the memory, we are changing the memory. And that is what you do when you write about it, and what people do when they read your books. And as you said, with the war in 2022, a lot of my patients said it felt like they had tried to reach the most safe place in the world, fleeing to Sweden, and the world was not enough. The world is ending here, and there's war everywhere, and there's no safe place. And even the patients I met that came from Bosnia in the 90s or Chile in the 70s came back. And we actually know today that the long-term consequences, especially when we speak about elderly people, it's the same neurological structures in the brain that encode memories and that is affected by Alzheimer's, that is affected by PTSD. So even if you have an ordinary aging memory decline, you have a risk of developing late onset PTSD. And that is, as you say, it could be years or decades after the war. And then it's extremely hard for you and your loved ones and the healthcare to understand this is PTSD. The risk is they will say this is the beginning of Alzheimer. And you can cure PTSD, but you can't cure Alzheimer's. Yeah.
Thank you so much for such detailed explanations. And my other question is again to you, Frida. What are some of the common misconceptions of trauma and PTSD that you encounter in your daily work?
Well, what I foremost would like to say, that it brings me back to what I think is a hopeful message I want to give everyone listening, that we know that it's not as easy as one event and one illness. We know it's a progressive disorder, it's a stress-related disorder. Most people, most of us, will experience at least one potentially traumatic event in our lives. Most of us won't develop any kind of mental illness. But the more events we experience, the higher the risk to develop mental illness. This is not anything strange in itself. But that means that we actually, if you look at, well, I mostly work with refugees, and when we speak about refugee health, we focus a lot on things that have already happened. The pre-migration factors, the war, the persecution, the being forced to flee your home country. But what we know now from the research is that what happens afterwards, in a country like Sweden or Finland, the post-migration factors, they will affect if you will develop an illness as PTSD just as much as the pre-migration factors. This gives us a tremendous power and possibility to stop this kind of cumulative building block response dose development. We can actually make sure that people don't develop a memory disorder that has as a main symptom keeping you over and over again reliving the worst of your memories and experiences as if it was happening here and now. I think that is, you could be kind of scared knowing this, and there's a lot of stressful situations as an asylum seeker, as new in a country, in exile, but we can do it. We can create conditions so people don't have to develop PTSD and other stress-related disorders.
So, thank you. And Sofia, I know that in the past you have described your fiction works as autofiction, which I believe is a very interesting concept. What I would like to know is, what are some of the basic challenges that you face while writing such deeply personal and painful experiences?
Well, I don't nothing that is related to any personal issues is actually challenging at all. Thing with writing about Russia, history and Soviet Union, the biggest challenge might be, from my point of view, for example, finding the terms that translate into different languages, because most of the concepts are actually concepts coming from Russian language. Most of my characters are, well, in my latest novel, Dog Park, they are Ukrainians. most of my characters are Estonians, and I'm writing in Finnish, and writing about concepts that actually don't exist in Finnish language. So in a way that I have to be able to find expressions that sound natural and spoken, and yet they have to be in a way recognizable about what I'm writing about. Things like that are challenges. What is also then also I cannot make historical mistakes, which is much more severe if you are a severe issue if you write about Russia-related matters. I have to say that sometimes when I think about other authors writing about other historical matters, then I'm like, oh my God, you can make all the mistakes in the world and now nobody actually cares. But I can't do that. Because it undermines my credibility, it is useful for the Russian disinformation operations and so on. So these are actually the issues that are quite time-consuming.
Can I? Sure. Just tagging on what you're saying, because I think this is another parallel between writing and being an author and working in psychotherapy, because we work, of course, many of my patients has been in Sweden for a long time, so they speak perfect Swedish. But we usually work with translators anyway. And that is exactly because of what you're talking about. We need to be able to find the right nuance, the right word for the patient, how it sounds in the patient's head, the sounds, the expressions, and then we can reawaken the memory correctly, and then we can have post-event information and different interpretations and change the memory. But I think that's also very interesting what you say about you're not allowed to making mistakes. Because what we do know about memory is that memory is not about videotaping a conversation or an event. Everyone remembers everything differently. And as I said, every time we think about the memory, we change it. Yeah. So that is something very interesting about historical events and books.
Well, let's say, for example, a word fascist, which is now since 22 Western world was surprised and woke to a reality where certainly invasion is justified by the word fascism, and quite many people, journalists, were asking, like, has Putin gone crazy, and considered most of the Russian propaganda something like laughable. It sounds like a joke. It makes no sense. Then again, which means that now we come back to the question about what is trauma. It feels totally different if you are from the area where actually a genocide has been justified with the same phrases. And let me tell you, there is absolutely nothing funny about that. So in that way, anyone from Eastern European countries or Baltic states, we cannot, it is weird to see, Finnish people also laughing that, oh, this is so ridiculous. Russia. No, it's not actually, because it has killed us before. So in that way, there's absolutely nothing funny about it. And also we take certain phrases very seriously. And I think, for example, the misuse of the word fascist should be considered in the same way we are actually taking seriously certain anti-Semitic expressions. So in that way, we should be on the same level, because genocides and war crimes, liquidation of group of people has been justified with the same words that many people in Western countries consider ridiculous. That is why also when you listen to the Russian propaganda, then the Western ears don't simply hear it in the same way, and they don't see it the way it actually affects also emotionally into those people living in those countries where we have like a baggage with those words, and that we know that what can be done with those words, and they don't also see that it is one way of dehumanizing us.
So then this next question is to both of you. What do you think is, how can writing and storytelling can serve as tools for healing second generational trauma, and what is the role of art in processing and expressing traumatic experiences?
So, if I start as the psychologist, I would say there are of course very important differences between writing about a story because you write a story and writing about a story because you're processing an event. But I would say it's very, very often it's kind of the same, or it's parallel, or it's kind of merged together. And so in therapy we work a lot with the written word, but also people reading. So you have bibliotherapy, people reading books like your books, and recognizing themselves, feeling validated, feeling less isolated, feeling like, okay, so I wasn't crazy thinking about this. This is normal. This is something that happens. But we also know that it's a very powerful tool to ask people to write down your memories. Because do you know what you do when you write down a memory? You destroy it. Yeah.
That's a good point.
Because you only write some things down. Yeah. So you write down what you think is most important. I was on a book fair. This happened to me. I met these people. But of course, there's a lot of information you don't write down. So you have a very narrow way of speaking about the memory. And our language doesn't really handle all the smells and the visceral effects and so on. So we make the memory less powerful. And then when we edit it, like you do with your books, you have new perspective, you have so you actually weaken the original memory.
Yeah.
So this is something we use in therapy. We ask people to write very detailed, to get a good order chronologically, so you can see what happened, to play a little bit with what ifs and be playful with it. Because you actually break down your original memory. I think it's a very fascinating thing.
Well, as I said, that in Finland, the generation of my parents and grandparents, especially men, dealt with traumas with alcohol, and not with writing, I have to say. But I think, part of the national trauma process is actually the fact that historical novels are unusually popular in Finland. It is, if you compare the number of titles, but also what is selling, then actually in Finland, our novels about our history, that is Winter War, that's like, there's a steady flow. And especially the older generation, we had a couple of war authors who maybe were not actually read by the women or the younger generation, but it was like a steady bestseller for every single Father's Day. They were really loved and important. I think this is kind of one way of dealing with traumas as well. And I know that, for example, my books have been, in some families, has been a kind of something that has passed on at least some sort of understanding of the past from a younger generation, because the older people, they just simply might not want to talk about it. It's too painful, but they can actually give books about these subject matters, and they can bring people together and and create actually mutual experience. And so in that way, art is pretty amazing. And in Finland, during the Finlandization, it was complicated to talk publicly about the war. So in that way, I think actually our literature has been very important for traumas in Finland. And probably that, I believe, is something that I can imagine that when it comes to Ukraine, then the future generation of authors, when they start writing fiction about these about the war, then it will be something. It will be a cornerstone or the the major identity story for the future generations in Ukraine, and now it's always going to take some time before authors start writing novels or fiction about certain big events. In Finland, we didn't start writing about our wars. It took a while. Also, after the Second World War, it wasn't like that. The moment the peace treaty was signed, then the moment authors started to write about Holocaust, no, it was not like that at all. It's something, you need to calm down a bit and have a certain kind of distance before you start writing fiction or novels. Ukrainians are writing a lot of poetry. Poetry is something that can, take place at once, but novels take more time.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, it comes in waves. And something we see that takes a very long time is writing about things that make you feel ashamed or guilty. And that's often something that divides the society. So we're back in the second generational trauma. And what does trauma do to a society? About trust and issues regarding trust, and what really happened, and what did we learn from the conflict, and who are our heroes, and what are our collective past. And that is what makes literature so powerful, I think.
So this next question is to you, Sofi. In the past, in your most recent work, Same River Twice, you explore the impact of state operation and conflict on women and marginalized gender. So what I would like to know more is, could you please talk a bit more about the role of misogyny in conflict and displacement, and also where did you get the inspiration to work on this subject?
Last spring, I gave a speech at the Swedish Academy. There was a conference about the freedom of expression, and I wrote about the Putin's war against women. And the feedback was so strong and positive that it encouraged me to extend the essay. I was in the beginning, I was just writing an extended essay, and then it turned out to be a book. But I felt that I cannot actually focus or try to explain sexual abuse committed by Russian army. I couldn't explain it without the context and without also shedding some light on women's rights in Russia. Because what we also know about other conflicts, that the worse the women's rights are in the territory or in the area or in the country where the soldiers are coming from, the more likely they are going to commit sexual crimes. So in that way, it is more likely than if we put all men, in a line, and then which one is the likely one to commit the sexual crimes, then Swede is less likely than Russian, simply because the women's rights are different from that point of view. But it also means that you have to have acceptance from the home front, which is important. And of course, all countries and wars and conflicts are different, but there are certain things that are common. And one of the things is that the country you are coming from, that the women's rights are not in a good shape. And if Russian soldiers don't even respect women's rights in Russia, so it's not likely they are respecting more the rights of the enemy men either. And what is now new, actually, the fact that also Russia is abusing and assaulting men sexually, that's not a new thing as such. But what is new is that we are having quite many court cases with male survivors. And if we think about the past gender-related conflicts or wars, then the focus has been on female victims, which doesn't mean that there hasn't been male victims, but in a way that this is actually a quite big thing.
So I think also we see in conflicts all over the world that you use a culture, a macho culture, it becomes a kind of a silence culture for women who get subjected to sexual violence, but other kinds of violence as well. It's kind of the person who did this to you want to show the world that your husband or brother or whoever male person you have close to you couldn't protect you. So if you go to the courts or the police or to the media and tell something about, if you go to the healthcare and ask for help, you are kind of doing what the torturer or the militia wanted. So that is also a problem. And if I take it home to my context, we see a lot of relationship violence as well, because as you say when you speak about post-traumatic stress in Finland, you have a lot of problems with emotional regulation, you have a lot of avoidance, you have a lot of self-medication with alcohol. We don't want to speak about people who have survived terrible wars as being people who can't handle their emotions, getting angry and annoyed at home, but it does heighten the risk for relationship violence. And this is also very important to understand. This is long consequences of war as well. And something that I feel is very important to speak about this, that something when we speak about women, for example, we know from research very clearly that people who have PTSD have a higher likelihood. I was speaking about the cumulative curve. The more events you have experienced, the higher the risk you develop disease or disorder. But it's also the other way around. If you have the disorder and all the symptoms coming with the disorder, there's a higher risk that you will be in a high-risk situation. If you have been taken advantage of, you maybe don't have the bodily integrity to say no. You feel, I have to do this to be loved or to make money, or and you have the self-medication that makes you more likely to be a victim of more violence. So the very tragic thing is that the person who has been through a lot of difficult events in their lives, they have the risk of the memory disorder keeping them in that moment, but also experiencing more moments like that if we don't stop it. And actually it is the research concerning women and sexual violence is very strong on this.
Since we are on the subject, I have had friends who have experienced therapy and talking about trauma as a negative thing, and they have. Well, for me, myself, it has backfired in a way, and it has felt like I've opened the door. And now I don't know how to close it, and instead of feeling calm, I felt like this rage inside me, and that's why I have decided not to go to therapy or talk about it more. So how can one handle this? Is there any way that I don't know how to formulate this question, but for people who are like me, who doesn't know how to go on with therapy or talking about trauma, is there any tips that you have?
So I really would hope that everyone entering into trauma therapy, their psychologist will tell them, in the long run, you will get better. This is another one of the myths, that you can't cure PTSD. You definitely can cure PTSD. You need to have the courage to know that we can cure PTSD. It's not something that you will have to live with forever. But in the short run, you will feel worse. You will get worse in the start of therapy, and this is true for almost every kind of therapy. And one of the reasons for that is a part of the PTSD symptoms is avoidance. Avoiding strong memories, avoiding strong feelings that could trigger the trauma memories, the flashbacks, the nightmares. And that means that when you start therapy, we start to speak about it, and then you will feel it more, and you will have more nightmares and more flashbacks, and you will feel worse. And even after PTSD, you can develop other kind of disorders. I have a lot of people with a lot of complex grief, and depression afterwards because they have been living with PTSD for decades. And it has changed their relationships and their lives and what they could have done with their lives. So I would hope that everyone starting therapy would be given the advice, it will be harder in the beginning. I need you to trust me, to stick with me. Because if you leave therapy before you start to get better, there's a high risk you never want to be in therapy again, and you will leave it before you get the results. But I told you also about that we are trying out new methods. We have the methods working well for PTSD. They are from the 70s, but they are working well for most people. But it's still a very long and painful process speaking about the traumatic memories. So we did this study in one of our clinics about the intensive trauma treatment, and I'm not going to speak about it for a very long time, but those of you who are interested, it's a short-term therapy. We are doing it 5 days a week. So we start with Monday, and then the patient comes and they stay for 2 double sessions. It's really hard work. I'm not going to lie to you. It's really hard work. And you do it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then the patient comes back on Thursday and they say, I didn't have any nightmares tonight. And then on Friday, we actually have done what we usually do in a year. We get as good results in a week. A painful week, a hard week, but as in a year. And this won't work for everyone. But the more we learn about how memory works, the better the treatment.
And one thing is that, in Nordic countries, we, I think, can trust that we are not using punitive psychiatry. But the problem is that, Russia is actually now, again, going back to the Soviet time practices of using punitive psychiatry. And because there is a strong tradition to that, that also means that people coming from certain territories simply do not trust therapeutists. They simply do not because they cannot, which is understandable. But also in totalitarian regimes, people do learn to cure themselves, which it doesn't mean that it's linguistics. But there's American researcher Joanne Gaith who actually interviewed, that was before the war, Gulag survivors, and wanted to explore their surviving methods, because Gulag was traumatizing experience for every single person and their families. And there were different ways how to cope with it. And one of the interesting ones was gardening. And what I think is gardening is interesting because, that is something that comes also with very different groups of survivors. For example, there was this group of Jesuit women who were taken to Germany to heal because they have been through a lot. And they didn't actually, therapists were not really able to work with them. They didn't want to. But over time, they started to grow roses. And actually, quite many of them also went to therapy later on. But, sometimes, something very simple can actually be a path to something else. And so nurturing, I think Joanne Gaith uses the word nurturing, caring. It doesn't matter if it's a pet, dog, rose, garden, apple tree, but, taking care of something is actually something that actually can be, a starting point for something, a new future.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Thank you. And do you think, and this question is for both of you, do you think sharing stories of trauma have any impact on the broader community and society? Start with you.
I definitely do. And I think we know we do need more stories. We need more perspective. If you don't tell your stories, others are going to tell your story or going to tell their stories and say it's your story. You were speaking about the words we're using. I think the word refugee today have a extremely negative tonality, and we need to take it back and we need to explain it and give different perspectives on it. So I think it's extremely important to have a story regarding it, and I think not to forget, I totally agree with you with different kinds of therapy, very concrete, have it in your hand, but I am a fan of talking therapy and stories and storytelling, and we also have post-traumatic growth. We know that people who share their stories and feel a value of sharing their stories, helping others to heal, helping society to understand what's happened, trying to make it never happen again, that we have actually a life that feels more worth in a way. So we have the post-traumatic growth, and I think that's what UNHCR in part does with the speaker program, sharing the stories so more can see this and this will be a part of society.
Definitely, yes. And what I've learned with my translations, my first book was published in 2003 in Finnish. And at the time, I was not expecting to have any translations, and I was not expecting that, people in countries very distant, geographically from Estonia would be interested in what's happening in this part of the world. But it turned out that, sharing traumatic experiences and stories through literature doesn't actually know the borders of countries or even cultures. So in that way, it's more like, uniting. It's a uniting experience.
So this is a question that just popped into my mind. People coming to Europe as refugees and immigrants, and especially when they get deported, when they have to go back to their countries, of course they bring trauma and PTSD with them, most of them. But these people who go back to their countries, they surely get haunted by the trauma that they have experienced on the way, right? So is there any method for them to deal with what they have seen and the rejection that they have faced?
I think it's important to realize that you can get stuck in your trauma. We speak about identity of trauma when you start to identify what happened to you and you can't move forward. And as some part this is important because you need to bear witness of what had happened, but you can also get stuck in your disorder, in your illness, in your memories. But we can do a lot for people who are forced to return as well. As I said, who is a refugee and what's defined as a refugee in the Swedish law is really different today than what it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. We know that a lot of people who would have been able to get protection and asylum in Sweden 20 years ago don't get that protection today. So we need to find a way to scale up intervention and help people wherever they are. And yes, there are a lot of therapies and working methods that you could use all over the world. And I would say actually, and this is a good way to close this conversation a bit also, because we have a therapy method called narrative exposure therapy. And that's actually, it's developed and researched on in refugee camps. So we have for a long time said you can't treat trauma when you're living in a dangerous situation, in a refugee camp or back in the conflict. But actually research has proven us wrong. And wherever you are, you should be able to heal as best as possible. So we do have methods for that as well.
So I have come to the end of my questions, and so do you have any advice for people who want to use writing and storytelling or art as a method to express and process their traumatic experiences? I mean, how deep can someone go in when they write about their personal issues?
I think it's important to realize that you can treat trauma when you're living in a dangerous situation, in a refugee camp or back in the conflict. But actually research has proven us wrong. And wherever you are, you should be able to heal as best as possible. So we do have methods for that as well. You go first now.
Well, I don't know what's the definition of deep, so I cannot answer to that. But what is sure about writing is that it will never harm you. That's the key thing about and it is also a very affordable way of helping yourself. And when you are helping yourself, you are helping also others. And also, those political prisoners who have survived like years of solitary isolation, then actually those who come out with clear mind are the ones who have been telling stories in their head, which Vladimir Bukovsky, who was a dissident, probably the most famous dissident of the Soviet era, who was imprisoned several times, and he has written a book called Building a Castle. And he was in solitary quite many times, and he said that he was building this castle in his head all the time. And if you don't have, and that is actually the most probably, those who have been in those kind of situations say that solitary is the most difficult thing, because there's absolutely nothing you can do. Simply, there's nothing to do. But you can actually write the book or your memoirs in your head. So even if you don't have a pen, you can tell the stories. Or building a castle, as he was building that castle, he was actually decorating his castle. He was going through his imaginary library. So that is how he didn't go mad. So even the most extremely difficult situation, narration can keep you sane.
Yeah, I agree with you a lot, and I think the biggest problem or the advice I would give is most authors writing about what they have experienced themselves, their problem is not lying in what they are writing or how they are writing, it's the listeners. Are the listeners ready to read this and understand this, or will they react in a way that could be harmful for you? Can you keep your integrity and your dignity while writing something very personal? In 10 years, do you want the world to know this or don't you? So having a bit of distance, I think, is a very useful advice. Edit a lot, revise it a lot, because it changes the memory. Try to be a little bit playful. Add things, as I said, what ifs and a different perspective and new information, because when you experienced something you were terrified, but now you know you survived. So that actually changes the feelings in that event. And don't forget about the actual positive memories, because they are there as well, but we forget them because we don't want to think about the bad stuff, so we don't allow us to think about the good stuff either. So that would be my advice. Remember the good stuff as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this very helpful and fascinating conversation, and thank you everybody for coming. I don't think we have time for taking questions from the audience. No? Thank you.